Well, hey guys, all you wiretappers out there, welcome back to the show. I'm back here in the studio of Gangland Wire, but I've got a famous man here, a guy that agreed to come on the podcast, Jason Cavanagh. I got on to Jason. I was researching this story, Jimmy Chagra Story, and I found this podcast called Son of a Hitman, and I listened to it. It was about Charles Harrelson, who was the man who was convicted of murdering Judge John Wood, and Jimmy Chagra was not convicted. He was arrested and accused of paying Charles Harrelson. And Jason did a real in-depth, deep dive into the life of Charles Harrelson, the Hitman. It was a great podcast. It's called Son of a Hitman, and I highly encourage you to listen to that. Jason, welcome. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, where can guys find that Son of a Hitman? It's not on the Apple app, so you explain to them how to find that.
Sure. So it is, we originally produced it for Spotify with Spotify. So it is exclusive to Spotify at the moment. Although actually today, I just spoke to Spotify. We're going to be getting a wide release where it's going to be available on all platforms in the near future, probably in a couple weeks. So at the moment, check it out on Spotify, but yeah, it will be wide very soon.
Okay, and by the time this is released, guys, just look for Son of a Hitman on whatever podcast app you've got, and you're going to be able to find it. So I looked at this story, and it's a story that just keeps on giving. This Jimmy Chagra and his whole marijuana smuggling operation is. We've already had a couple of episodes, 3 episodes by now, and it's the most complex, interesting. And he is the most complex and interesting guy and story that I have done, that I can find so much information about too. It's just, it's amazing. And I want to go in on a deep dive on Charles Harrelson with Jason, because he is the expert on Charles Harrelson. And as you all know, he is the father of Woody Harrelson, the actor. And as I understand it, Woody's not real crazy about anybody doing, and there's no movies about this. I don't know if you've noticed that, guys, but there's no movies about this, and I don't know if there ever will be. Jason, we talked a little bit before, and Harrelson goes back into South Texas, got Texas roots, and he was a Texas criminal for sure from day one. Tell us a little bit about that first murder, I think, that Berg murder.
The first murder that Charles Harrelson was charged with was Alan Berg. He was a carpet salesman in Houston, Texas. I was introduced to the story of Charles, based on the rumors. He claimed that he had been involved in the JFK assassination. So that was how I entered into this story in the first place, began looking at it. Then, of course, the Judge Wood murder, the assassination of a federal judge in '79 is huge news. But then when you start doing research, looking back further, he killed this carpet salesman. Whether it's the first murder he committed, I don't know. It's the first murder he was charged with. He was found not guilty for this murder. I don't know whether it looks as if he did commit this murder, and he had a good lawyer and he was able to get off. But yeah, this was a carpet salesman in Houston, Texas. His younger brother, David Berg, wrote a great book about this called Run, Brother, Run. I spoke to David, went to Houston, met with him, spoke with him about it. Through his research, he determined that, and even at the time of his brother's murder, he believed that this man, who, again, I'm going to say was found not guilty for hiring Charles Harrelson to kill this guy, but a rival carpet salesman named Frank DeMaria is who was accused of having hired Charles Harrelson to assassinate or kill David Berg. It was like a long-standing beef that these guys had over people owing each other money. Through my research, it looked as if Alan Berg, the first victim, he had some big gambling debts to some not so desirable people. This guy, Ted Lewin, who was involved in organized crime. He was an associate of Meyer Lansky. Alan Berg owed him like $100,000 or something over a basketball game. As the story goes, Charles Harrelson met this guy, Frank DeMaria, in a bar. Frank DeMaria said, I'm having this problem with this guy. Charles Harrelson threw his business card down on the table and said, I could take care of that for you. And his business card is this insane thing. I don't have it in front of me, but it's this long list of things that he does, including assassinations. I also spoke to Charles Harrelson's And again, I want to repeat, Frank DeMaria found not guilty. He was not convicted of this. So in no way, am I saying he did this, but this is Charles Harrelson's ex-girlfriend from that time, 1968, was this woman, Sandra Sue Attaway. I was able to speak to her. She's since passed away. But I spoke to her on the podcast. She described having accompanied Charles Harrelson to go pick up this guy, Alan Berg, from a bar. She had called Alan Berg prior to this, said, "Hey, I've seen you around. Meet me at this bar." Promised sexual favors. Charles Harrelson showed up with her in the car, forced Alan Berg into the car at gunpoint, drove him out to a swampy area, and shot him. Charles then was picked up a couple of years later. So his brother, Claude, was a police officer and was actually working as a private investigator at the time. And the Berg family was trying to find out what happened to Alan. He had just gone missing. They didn't know where he was. They were assuming the worst, but, didn't know what had happened, and hired like a slew of private investigators, one of which was Claude Harrelson, who happened to be Charles Harrelson's brother. And so that was a strange thing. And he was trying to get money out of them. He was saying, listen, I can get some more information, but I need you to give me more money. And so on first appearances, it looked like Claude was in on this thing, that he was in on a scheme with Charles to try to extort money out of these people. But when I spoke to Sandra Sue and looked back at the police interviews that she had done, it appeared that Charles and Claude did not get along. They were not friends. I think partially because Claude was law enforcement and Charles was as far from that as you could get. Claude, I believe, had a suspicion that his brother was involved and was trying to get information out of his brother or one of his associates, and was asking for more money to give to those people to get them to talk. So I don't think he was actually in league with Charles at that point. I think he was actually, working on his own, actually, trying to tell the family what had happened. Because Sandra Sue described him taking her out to dinner or lunch or something like that and trying to get information out of her, basically like milking her for information. Ultimately, it was a guy she ran off with who ended up talking and telling the cops what she had told him happened. And then she was willing to cooperate with police for immunity, and she testified against Charles. But he was able to get a good alibi. He said he was doing a horse trade at the time, that he was buying a horse with some brothers who were from the same town where he had grown up, Lovelady, Texas, or one town over. And they gave him a good alibi. He was represented by Percy Foreman in that first murder trial, which was unusual in that Percy Foreman was an extremely famous defense attorney at the time. And Charles Harrelson, by all appearances, was just, this low-level thug. So, as we started looking at that, we're going, how did he get put in touch with someone like Percy Foreman at this point in time? And, we were looking closer at that sort of organized crime angle. We did find that he was working with some famous gamblers at the time, doing collections and things like that. Jack Treetop Strauss, his name was thrown around as somebody who was doing collections for. And then there was also Benny Binion ran gambling operations around that area of East Texas, and then eventually moved out to Vegas, which is where Charles Harrelson ended up, in the late 70s when he did commit that murder of the judge. So
interesting. That whole Las Vegas world is central to this whole thing. It runs all the way through it, starting with Benny Binion down in Texas, but he moves to Vegas and the whole Vegas connection and the Chagras, and it is throughout the whole thing. It's kind of amazing. Jimmy Chagra hired pilots to fly drugs he had met because the guys worked an air charter service out of Las Vegas, and it's pretty amazing that Las Vegas was such a part of this whole scheme from one end to the other, starting with that. Now, did I read somewhere where there's some supposition that Harrelson just knew that this guy was DeMaria was mad at Berg and he killed him, then came to him and wanted money? Is that so? Would that be possible?
It's, there were people that said that's something that Harrelson and his associates would do. Someone suggested that. Whether that happened in this case, I don't know. Ultimately, I did speak with a woman. I had covered the Berg murder in the second and third episodes of the podcast, and then actually, as episodes started airing, people would reach out to me with new information because they would listen. People who I didn't even know existed or were involved in these cases. And one person who reached out was a woman who had been friends with Frank DeMaria back then. And she claimed, again, whether this is true, I don't know. He denies this. He denied involvement and, had no comment. But she said that he made a tearful confession to her one night, drunkenly, saying, "I killed that boy." She took that to mean he shot him. But I spoke to Sandra Sue Attaway, who told me that she watched Charles Harrelson kill him. So, who knows? Who knows?
So that's another thing is a witness when he does the murder. And if I remember right, that you found that he seemed to like to have witnesses whenever he did a murder, right? Which I can't explain that one, but you found that to be true.
For the first two murders that he was charged with, the second murder being Sam DeGilia, who's a grain dealer in Texas. And, it looked like this guy, Pete Scamardo, who, again, he was found not guilty. But this guy, Pete Scamardo, allegedly hired Charles Harrelson to kill a guy who he had a business dispute with. And in that case, Charles Harrelson brought along this guy, Jerry O'Brien Watkins, who abetted in, they picked up this guy. They told him they were, I can't remember what they told him they were going to do. They drove out to some, remote grain silo or something and forced him out of the car at gunpoint. O'Brien Watkins ended up testifying against Harrelson again. You would think he learned after the first one, like, when you bring somebody along, they're going to testify against you.
Really?
But he was actually picked up for, this was just a year after the Berg murder, and he was picked up for the two murders simultaneously. Got found not guilty on the Berg murder, but before he was released, they then tried him for the DeGilia murder, and he was found guilty of that. Only did 5 years for murdering this guy, and then gets out, and then a year later, Judge Wood is assassinated.
So he was kind of a heavy drug user and a heavy drinker. I won't call him an alcoholic, but more than likely he was. And he then gets into some cocaine dealing and drug dealing too. What do you remember about that? It wasn't real extensive, but he tried to get into it.
Sure, yeah. From all accounts, he would inject cocaine. He would shoot up cocaine, which is it's a choice.
It's unusual, yeah.
It's unusual, right? But yes, I read that, and this was from his own testimony in the Judge Wood trial. He claimed that he was trying to set up some drug deals in Mexico, and they were actually planning to hollow out some golf clubs and fill them with cocaine, and then smuggle them across the border. Obviously, these were the days before those scanners, TSA and all that, for whatever, I don't know that plan came to fruition, but he claimed that it was, Chagra was not paying me to kill the judge. He was paying me for some drugs. So I was doing a drug deal and helping in that, I don't know that I believe that to be the case, but that was a claim he made. So, yeah, I think he was involved in some low level drug deals here and there. I think he was a guy, he was a freelance criminal, right? It was, you need me to move drugs, you need me to move weapons, you need me to kill somebody, I'm available, I'm for hire.
They've drawn the parallels between him and Woody Harrelson's character in Natural Born Killers also, I understand.
Yeah, another interesting one is No Country for Old Men.
Yeah.
In the Cormac McCormick novel, he references they killed a judge in 1979. He's referring to the Judge Wood assassination. And then Woody plays a hitman in No Country for Old Men.
That's right.
That was ironic. Yeah.
Art imitates life, huh?
Yeah. Oh, and I'm sure the connection wasn't lost on him. I'm sure he knew it is too.
No, I'm sure it wasn't, because he was pretty heavily involved in his dad's life later on after he gets convicted and goes to the penitentiary. I talked to a guard up there, and he said, he used to come in all the time. He says, a really nice guy. So what else about Harrelson that you think it's important? Is he meanders through the seamy underbelly of South and Midwest Texas, mid Texas, and on up to Las Vegas.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that was interesting, we found, he told anybody who would listen that he was involved in the JFK assassination. I spoke to multiple people who he had personally told them, oh yeah, I did that. And so we were looking into what's the veracity of that. Is any of that true? Is there even a realm of a possibility of a world in which he could have been involved? And one of the things that was interesting, we found that guy, Jerry O'Brien Watkins, who abetted in the second murder of Sam DeGilia. We found FBI documentation on him that said he trained in a guerrilla warfare camp down in Cuba pre-revolution. Or I can't remember, I think it was anti-Castro, I'm sorry, which was, the CIA for a long time was trying to get rid of Castro. And at times working with organized crime elements to do so. There's a lot of theories that the JFK assassination was linked to organized crime, to potentially people who had been involved in the Bay of Pigs, Cuban exiles who were then unhappy that that program ended to try to get rid of Cuba. JFK pulled the plug on that. Charles Harrelson also, there's rumors that he knew Jack Ruby, that he was smuggling guns down to Cuba. Potentially that's his connection to Jerry O'Brien Watkins. I don't know. Woody has said that his dad was in the CIA. There didn't appear to be any proof of that.
Yeah.
That being said, could he have done some work with some people who were working for the CIA? Yes, entirely possible. Yeah. Around that time. Beyond that, I mean, I think another guy who he was said to have run with was this guy, Larry Culbreth. Someone told me they believed he was the person who shot Judge Wood and not Charles Harrelson. Larry Culbreth was someone who he killed a guy who was rumored to be the head of the Dixie Mafia, was found guilty of it, did no prison time, which suggests he was at the very least an informant working with police, if not more. So there were some interesting elements there where it's like, who are these guys connected to? Who are they working for? Who are they working with? Similarly with Charles Harrelson, he kills Sam DeGilia. He just does 5 years and then he's out on the street again.
Yeah,
it's Texas, but it's a short prison term.
It was, but when you get into that kind of level of organized crime, people that do crime for a living, local politicians and even judges and prosecutors, people drink in some of the same bars, and they know each other. And there's these kind of seamy businessmen are in and around that too, and they like that. They like to gamble, and so they go to these same card games and high stakes card games. So I've seen this, it's just like, what is that guy doing with that guy? It just doesn't make sense. But usually it's gambling. Really, gambling is a big kind of the glue that holds a lot of that together. I believe it that he did have those connections, and that CIA thing during that time, that around the Bay of Pigs, the CIA was hiring all kinds of freebooters. There's a mob guy out of Chicago whose real name was Italian, but he went by Richard Kane, and he had been a Cook County sheriff or something up there. He'd kind of been around law enforcement, and he disappears, and he's down. He's got some kind of a deal down in South Florida working with the CIA. I think they hired all kinds of freebooters like that. People wanted to be mercenaries, and they went in and ripped them off for some money and trained, and then went back home. So it all makes sense now. If I remember right, that picture, there's a famous picture of the cops leading off some people, and one of them kind of looks like Charles Harrelson. I wonder if anybody's ever put a one of these AI facial identifications things to match those two up.
So what I'll say, I've seen that photo, obviously. It's the three tramps, the three tramps theory that, there were actually these guys got picked up from the grassy knoll, and that they made, people who believe there were multiple shooters. It wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald. And one of those guys, yes, he looks similar to Charles Harrelson looks later in life. Back at that point in time, I saw a photo of him. An ex-girlfriend of Charles Harrelson's from high school sent me a photo of him from high school. And this was only a few years later. And he was a skinny little guy.
Yeah.
He's the three tramps, the guy who people say that looks like Charles Harrelson. It resembles him, but he's like a bigger guy. He's a little heavier set, which Charles Harrelson looked like that once he was picked up for the Judge Wood assassination, but that's in 1979. That's ages later. Personally, I don't believe that's him. I will say, I think the Harrelson brothers, his sons, I believe they will, off the record, I think they believe that he had something to do with it. I don't think they think he was one of the three tramps, but I also think they enjoy the intrigue that surrounds it. Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking about the gambling as the connection between law enforcement and some of these criminals. When I looked back I found some pages of Charles Harrelson's journal from when he was in prison. Didn't get to see all of it, but from the pages that I did see, he talked about when he was in high school back in Lovelady, Texas, he would go to these underground gambling dens and play cards with these guys. And he described like a guy who was a judge, a lot of law enforcement guys. And that's where he picked up gambling. That's where he learned to do it. And from the time that he was young, he was like a young teenager and he was going to these games and then became a card shark, But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's where that comes from.
Yeah.
Those connections.
So his gambling, moving on a little farther forward, I mean, he makes contact, I would assume, with Jimmy Chagra. The first time appears to me, I'm not sure, is in Las Vegas. Jimmy Chagra was like one of the most audacious, well-known gamblers in Las Vegas back in these days. He was bringing trunkloads of money and just depositing it at Caesar's Palace Casino with their cashier. He didn't even count it. They weighed it for him and then figured out about what it was and gave him credit for it. That's the way he washed his money back in those days. So I guess all those kind of people, quasi-criminals, I mean, a lot of us like to go to Vegas, but those quasi-criminals, if they like to gamble, they're going to gravitate to Vegas. So is that where he first met up with Chagra? Did he have a Texas connection or was it in Vegas?
So, I mean, the Chagras, obviously, they're based in El Paso, but Charles Harrelson first met Jimmy Chagra. I think he met his brother Joe first, but knew of Jimmy Chagra because Jimmy was known to, beyond just, he would throw his money around. He had so much cash, like more than he knows what to do with it. So he was a big tipper. Everybody said he would like give enormous tips and loved gambling and would gamble on anything. According to Charles Harrelson in his testimony for the assassination of Judge Wood, he claims that he went to Vegas trying to get into a card game with Jimmy Chagra so that he could rip him off gambling. They basically got a hold of some dealers, Caesar's Palace dealers' uniforms, were wearing those, and then set up a private game in a hotel room. And their plan was to rip off, as many people as they could. They would cheat at card. These guys were cheating to try to rip people off. And he claims that that's why he, initially tried to make contact with Jimmy Chagra. According to the FBI, he made contact at that point, and that's when this idea of, wanting the judge to get knocked off occurred, when that information was shared. Now, there's conflicting accounts whether Charles Harrelson and maybe some others went ahead and carried out the assassination and then said, hey, pay me. I did this, now pay me. Or whether Jimmy Chagra put the word out on the street, I want this judge knocked off. And then, I spoke to one person who said that he believed there were several groups who were basically, there was sort of a bounty put out on this judge. Several groups were saying like, hey, we're going to collect on this bounty. And then these are the guys who pulled it off. I recently spoke to someone who had, a few names came up in my research toward the end when I was trying to determine, did Charles Harrelson actually do this? Did he act alone in carrying out the assassination? And there were a group of names that came up that the FBI had determined these people didn't have anything to do with this. But other people who I've spoken to who were more involved in the criminal world said, no, these guys were involved in this thing. And one of the names that came up as being part of this group was this guy, Honest Charlie Potter, who I hadn't come across him. I just came across the name a few times in some of these FBI documents. I recently spoke to somebody who had reached out to me who said that, Charlie Potter was on his deathbed. I think he's still alive, but he's close to the end. And he asked him about the Judge Wood assassination. And this guy said, I don't have anything to say about that because there's people who were involved who are still alive. Charles Harrelson's not alive anymore. Jimmy Chagra's not alive anymore. So, to me, that suggests that there was a larger conspiracy here. Charles Harrelson hadn't acted alone in any of his previous murders that we know of. And I would be surprised if he went to, make the biggest assassination of his criminal career and he went alone without any help. They also found, the FBI found a ladder at Judge Wood's apartment complex. They found a ladder against one of the buildings leading to the roof. And they said to me, "Oh yeah, we determined that didn't have anything to do with the assassination." How'd you determine that?
Yeah, really.
In what way? It wouldn't surprise me if there were lookouts.
Yeah.
There were also sketches made. You look back at police sketches. There were sketches made of several different people from that time. I think ultimately, like, they had a case against Charles Harrelson. That was the case that they made because they could prosecute him and they could put him behind bars for it. And they needed to put somebody behind bars for it. But I do think there was a larger conspiracy at hand there. Among a larger group of people.
That would make sense. I mean, the way he's acted before, he brought somebody in to help him, and then the kind of the intricacy of it, to sitting in that parking lot waiting for the judge to come out by yourself, and does he come out? I mean, I've sat on people and you don't know when they're coming out, and if you get distracted just a little bit, all of a sudden they're out and they're in their car. And so he was, obviously, I think he probably had help. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, like you said, a lookout with a walkie-talkie, some other set of eyes on it, some other way to, have a chase car, a crash car, rather. If cops pulled in about that same time, then some car to take out the cops. I mean, it was a pretty important assassination. This was not just going and killing some carpet salesman.
100%. And bigger money involved. That Berg murder, I think it was like $5,000 or something like that. It's nothing. Whereas this $150,000, $200,000, it's it's a bigger score.
At least. Now, I like that theory that Chagra was just mouthing around about, somebody needs to kill that judge, and a guy like Harrelson hears that and he says, hey, let's go do this. I mean, he was that audacious. From what I learned about him, he was that audacious. He would just on his own go do that. And he would bring other people in. He didn't do that. In my opinion, he did not do that alone.
I agree. It doesn't appear to be the case. The official story is he did that alone. And it's interesting. He got found guilty for it, but Jimmy Chagra got off. But ultimately, I think he had a much better lawyer.
Oscar Goodman, the case of the century for Oscar Goodman to get a not guilty for Jimmy Chagra. With there was quite a little bit of evidence that piled up on him. But James Kerr, the prosecutor who worked in Judge Wood's court, and he was a ballsy, take no prisoners prosecutor too in this drug business. That court. Judge Wood court and that regular prosecutor assigned to that, man, you did not want to get in front of them if you were in the drug business. And somebody tried to kill him just not that long before. It was just crazy.
Yeah. Kerr, we were able to get in touch with him. He was did not want us to reveal his location.
No, really.
Still a little jump. I mean, hey, he survived getting his car riddled with bullets. Like, I can understand you're a little jumpy after that.
His brand new Lincoln Continental, I read that if there's one little pleasure he allowed himself, he had a new Lincoln Continental and they shot it all up.
Yeah. He said he stopped and his gloves fell out. It was a cold day. His gloves fell off the seat. He reached down to pick them up. It wasn't that he was just had the wherewithal to dodge these bullets. He reaches down to pick up his gloves and then gunfire opens up on his car. And because he's driving this big Lincoln Continental, he was protected. And they drove off without affirming that they had made the kill. And he survived the thing and then went into protective custody.
Wow.
And Judge Wood refused. They were giving him, they had people, Kerr said, he had people basically living in his house. Judge Wood, it was the same thing. They had people stationed in his house. And at some point he was like, I can't live like this.
Yeah.
Get the hell out of here. And ultimately he did get assassinated,
Yeah, it was crazy down there. A short period of time, assassination attempt of Kerr. Lee Chagra is killed, which turns out to be a drug ripoff. And then Judge Wood is killed. And that's Jimmy Chagra's brother, guys. And you know a lot more about him from the next podcast after this. I'm going to go into the murder of Lee Chagra big time, but just crazy time during that time.
It's wild. And, at first glance, you start going, whoa, is this some kind of insane conspiracy that involves more than this. The Lee death in particular, Lee Chagra, you're like, is this connected to this? Is this connected to this assassination attempt and then this other murder? But yeah, apparently no. Initially, I was thinking, oh, maybe there's some connection here that people haven't drawn yet. Looking into it further, it just looks like it's a random robbery gone wrong.
I think even we're speculating a little bit. I think even Jimmy Chagra, he thought maybe the government had killed his brother, and then let's go kill somebody else with the government. So,
and I think paranoia set in for Jimmy. By all accounts, his brother Lee was, it's his older brother. He was a successful defense attorney, and he believed that Lee would, if Jimmy got into trouble, that Lee would be able to get him out of it because he was an excellent attorney. And now Lee is murdered, and Jimmy's lost his safety net.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that, that now he didn't have Lee, and he's looking to go in front of Judge Wood without Lee. He feels naked. I got a feeling.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Really
That's how it's been described to me. And it makes sense. And then for the Kerr assassination attempt, they linked it to some guys out of New England, some organized crime guys out of New England having been involved in that. But, it does look as if Jimmy Chagra had connections to those guys through like Follies Cove. They were bringing marijuana up through the, it was in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And so, right. So because of that, they had to, pay their dues to the New England guys.
Never know. I think one last thing here, Charles Harrelson's woman, she bought the gun. She was intimately involved in this whole thing. She was part of the payoff money and everything. What do you remember about her? What kind of a woman is this that
Joanne Harrelson
is so involved in this thing? Like I said, she bought the gun. I know that if I remember right, they definitely tracked
they got
down to buying that sniper rifle. Like,
right.
And a gun.
They got her prints. They got her fingerprints on the contract to buy the gun or the license to get the gun, whatever it was at the time.
It was.
It seemed like she knew about his criminal activities, that she was intimately involved in it. As far as, she passed away, so I didn't get a chance to speak with her. From accounts, Charles, I don't know, was the nicest partner.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Oh, there were accounts of him being abusive and whatever. So whether Joanne was doing that stuff out of fear for her life, whether she was just doing it as she's going to benefit from this too, I'm not sure. I do know that there were attempts made to get her to flip on him. I know that Larry Colbreth was said to have been driving her to the courthouse every day for the trial, which, is that an intimidation thing? Don't say anything. Or is it just they're going, to bring her to the courthouse? But yeah, as she was intimately involved in it, they found, because they were recording all the visits to the prison.
Right.
They had wiretaps. They were recording his conversations. So they were recording his conversations with her. And then through those wiretaps, they found that he was actually he was having an affair with her daughter as well. And so through that, it was his stepdaughter, and through that, they were then tried to turn her on Charles by saying, hey, he's been sleeping with your daughter.
Yeah, of course.
You still want to stick your neck out for this guy? It's a messy thing. I think he had a lot of different female visitors who they found, oh, wow, this guy's got relationships with all different people here.
Yeah.
And he's, telling them all, promising them all the world, when I get out of here.
Yeah. Hey, there's guys in every penitentiary. They're exactly like that. I mean, exactly like that. They'll even talk them into helping them break out. I know one instance of that where then the woman ended up getting killed when she tried to hijack a helicopter to land and get her man out of prison. So, I mean, it's the ultimate in codependency here, I think. Everybody knows what codependency is. We once had a discussion at work about how there's more women in prison because of codependency, because they got some man or some drug addict man or some dude that they want to make him happy. They want to keep him happy because they're in this relationship. They're so dependent on the relationship that they'll go out and do stuff that then ends up putting them in the penitentiary.
Yeah.
So it's not that uncommon.
I think you're right. Like, it's a combination of intimidation, but also there's that like the seduction that's happening there and that codependency. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, Charles Harrelson actually did attempt to break out of prison, which is how he ended up in Supermax. He fashioned a rope ladder out of prison sheets. Wasn't even long enough to get over the wall. But he and 2 other inmates attempted an escape. The guards fired a warning shot, and they stopped. They gave in. They surrendered, and then they
was that at
they moved up to
Leavenworth?
Supermax. I'm trying to remember which prison he was in at that point. I think it must have been Leavenworth. Yeah,
Probably. Those walls are high. Leavenworth.
and when he had been in jail prior to the Berg trial, he attempted an escape where they found a gun in his cell that had gotten smuggled in somehow. They said he had been paying off the guards to like let lady friends visit.
Yeah.
So it might have been how that gun ended up in his cell, but the guards found it before he was able to use it to get out. But yeah.
Crazy. Yeah. Well, and I've heard another story exactly like that, where the guy ended up with a gun in his jail cell because she was just so infatuated. He was like a total professional criminal, had been all of his life, kind of a master criminal. And she smuggles him in a gun, and he ends up in a shootout with the guards, and one of them kills him. Mm-hmm. So, it's not unheard of. All right, Jason Cavanagh, Son of a Hitman, is a podcast. It's a really good podcast, guys. I know people listen to more. I listen to many podcasts, so I want to promote this one because I think it's worthwhile to listen to. It was a good one. I listened to every episode all the way through and was really entertained by it and educated too. I really appreciate that you did that, Jason.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on. This was
all right. Well, guys, don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles, and so look out for motorcycles when you're out there. If you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline number. You'll get some help there. If you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, go see our friend, former Gambino member, Anthony Ruggiano, and we're in the treatment center business down in Florida. You can go in the treatment center business and have a counselor who used to be a mob guy. I mean, and you can find a hotline number. He's got it on his website, anthonyruggiano.com. So thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, Jason.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. All right, thank you. All right, thank you.